Welcome back to the course on nutrition and planetary health, presented by the Physicians Association for Nutrition and PANCO. This course provides an evidence-based foundation for how dietary patterns influence both human health and planetary health, and how this knowledge can be applied in clinical practice to promote healthy and sustainable diets. Let's begin with the second module on the examples of healthy dietary patterns. In this module, we move from individual foods and nutrients to dietary patterns, which better reflect how people actually eat. You will explore three well-studied examples of dietary patterns associated with improved health outcomes: the Planetary Health Diet, the Mediterranean Diet, and the DASH Diet. Ready to dive in? Let's get started with Lesson 2.1 on the Planetary Health Diet. Before you begin this lesson, please answer the following question. This ungraded question is designed to get you thinking. If you are unsure, take your best guess. Which of the following best describes how the Planetary Health Diet was developed? A. It was designed primarily to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. B. It was based on traditional Mediterranean dietary principles. C. It was derived from synthesizing global evidence on diet and health outcomes. D. It was created as a vegan diet for global populations. The correct answer is C. It was derived from synthesizing global evidence on diet and health outcomes. Many assume that the Planetary Health Diet was created primarily as an environmental or ethical framework. In fact, it was developed as a reference diet for optimal health, based on a synthesis of global evidence on diet and health, similar to the evidence reviewed in the previous lesson. Environmental implications were assessed afterwards. In this lesson, we move from individual food disease associations to a whole dietary pattern. As our first example of a healthy dietary pattern, we look at how the Planetary Health Diet was developed, what it includes, how its reference ranges work, and what evidence supports its potential health benefits. Let's first discuss the origin and purpose of the Planetary Health Diet. In 2019, the first Eat-Lancet Commission on Healthy Diets from Sustainable Food Systems aimed to answer a dual challenge: how to feed a growing global population a diet that promotes human health while remaining within planetary boundaries. The 2025 Eat-Lancet Commission expanded and updated this work, reviewing more than 12,000 research citations and integrating health, environmental, and justice considerations. While the 2019 Commission first developed the Planetary Health Diet, the 2025 Commission updated its evidence base with minor adjustments to the reference ranges for food groups. Importantly, the Planetary Health Diet itself was developed based on evidence linking dietary patterns and food groups to human health outcomes. The Commission synthesized large cohort studies, meta-analyses, and trials, similar to the types of evidence reviewed in the previous lesson, and translated this into quantitative reference intake ranges for major food groups. The Commission further assessed its environmental footprint. Analyses showed that the Planetary Health Diet, a dietary pattern rich in plant foods and allowing none to moderate intake of animal source foods, would substantially reduce food-related greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and water use compared with current global averages. Thus, the Planetary Health Diet is both a health-promoting and environmentally sustainable dietary pattern. What is the Planetary Health Diet? The Planetary Health Diet is a global reference dietary pattern designed to optimize human health while being adaptable across cultures and energy requirements. This diet includes high intake of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, and nuts, none to moderate intake of dairy, fish, and poultry, depending on preferences, limited intake of red and processed meat, limited intake of added sugars and refined grains, emphasis on unsaturated fats rather than saturated fats. This structure mirrors the direction of evidence reviewed in the previous lesson. Foods associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer, and mortality are emphasized. Foods more associated with a higher risk are limited. The Commission provided quantitative reference intakes for an average adult consuming approximately 2,500 kcal per day. These values can be adapted to different energy needs, cultural food traditions, and local dietary patterns. The Planetary Health Diet translates evidence into approximate daily intake ranges for major food groups. These are not rigid prescriptions, but reference ranges developed by the Eat Lancet Commission within which health outcomes appear most favorable based on available evidence. For plant-based foods, daily targets include approximately 300 grams of vegetables, 200 grams of fruits, 200 grams of whole grains, 50 to 75 grams of legumes, and 50 grams of nuts. Higher intake of these foods aligns with consistent reductions in cardiometabolic disease and mortality across multiple meta-analyses. As discussed in Lesson 2, whole grains and fiber are associated with a lower risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer, and all-cause mortality. Fruits and vegetables are associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular and total mortality. Legumes and nuts are associated with favorable lipid profiles and lower mortality. If animal source foods are preferred, the Planetary Health Diet allows none to moderate intake of 250 grams per day of dairy, 30 grams per day of fish, 30 grams per day of poultry, 13 grams of egg, and red meat limited to approximately 1 serving per week. This is based on a synthesis of evidence that suggests processed meat and higher red meat intake are associated with increased cardiometabolic risk, and fish intake is associated with cardiovascular benefit, and dairy associations are mixed and context-dependent. However, when compared with plant-based protein sources such as legumes and nuts, plant foods tend to show more consistent associations with lower cardiometabolic risk and mortality in large cohort analyses. For fats, sugar, and sodium, the Planetary Health Diet emphasizes consuming unsaturated plant oils, limited saturated fats, added sugars limited to 30 grams per day, and sodium limited to 2,000 milligrams per day. These limits align with established evidence linking trans fats, high sodium, and high sugar intake to increased cardiometabolic risk. Now, what do reference ranges mean scientifically? The Commission did not define a single ideal intake value. Instead, it defined intake ranges. These ranges represent intervals within which disease risk appears to be lowest or most favorable, based on epidemiological and trial evidence. The reference ranges allow for flexibility across cultural food traditions, energy requirements, availability, affordability, and individual preferences. For example, vegetable intake may range from 200 to 600 grams per day while remaining consistent with lower risk patterns. Clinically, this supports pattern-based guidance rather than strict numerical targets. It encourages practical shifts rather than perfection. The Planetary Health Diet is often communicated visually as a plate model. Quantitative reference ranges are useful for researchers and policy modeling, but clinicians and patients often benefit from proportion-based guidance. The plate visual reflects the Planetary Health Diet, where approximately half the plate consists of vegetables and fruits. Whole grains form the primary staple. Legumes and nuts serve as central sources of protein. Animal source foods occupy smaller proportions, if preferred at all. And saturated plant oils are preferred over saturated fats. This proportional structure in the Planetary Health Diet reflects the direction and consistency of evidence reviewed in Lesson 2. Foods associated with lower cardiometabolic and mortality risk form the bulk of intake. Foods with more consistent associations with higher risk are limited in frequency and quantity. Portion guidance can be translated into the following practical shifts to achieve a planetary health diet. Replace refined grains with whole grains. Replace all or part of your meat intake with legumes. Use unsaturated oils such as olive, rapeseed, or peanut oil. Limit sugar-sweetened beverages and added sugars. Moderate sodium intake. For clinicians, visual plate models can simplify counseling. They can shift the focus from counting grams to adjusting proportions. This is often more realistic in busy clinical settings. However, this lesson introduces the framework only at a conceptual level. The final module of this course is dedicated entirely to practical application. In other words, if this section explains what the planetary health diet looks like, Module 4 will show you how to apply it in everyday practice. Now let's consider the health impact of adhering to the Planetary Health Diet. The 2019 Commission estimated that global adoption could prevent approximately 11 million premature deaths per year. Updated modeling in 2025 suggests the potential to prevent up to 15 million deaths annually. An analysis of global adherence to a healthy, sustainable dietary pattern consistent with the Planetary Health Diet reported that higher adherence was associated with approximately a 27% lower all-cause mortality. Further, environmental modeling indicates that widespread adoption could reduce food-related greenhouse gas emissions by 30 to 50%, land use by 45 to 70%, and freshwater use by 25 to 35% compared with current global diets. A key question for any global reference diet is whether it provides adequate intakes of essential nutrients across populations. Analysis by the 2025 Commission indicates that the Planetary Health Diet provides improved intake of several nutrients commonly suboptimal in current diets, including dietary fiber, unsaturated fatty acids, folate, magnesium, potassium, and zinc. These improvements are consistent with evidence reviewed in Lesson 2 linking higher whole grain and fiber intake with lower cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer, and mortality, and replacement of saturated fats with unsaturated fats with improved LDL cholesterol profiles. However, the 2025 Commission identifies nutrients requiring attention in specific groups. Vitamin B12 intake may be inadequate when animal source foods are limited, necessitating fortified foods or supplementation. Iron adequacy depends on bioavailability. Women of reproductive age may require careful dietary planning. Calcium intake depends partly on dairy or fortified alternatives, and iodine adequacy varies by geography and iodized salt use. These considerations are not unique to the Planetary Health Diet, but reflect standard clinical practice when recommending plant-forward dietary patterns. Overall, the evidence indicates that the Planetary Health Diet can be nutritionally adequate when appropriately planned, with attention to defined risk groups. Up to this point, we have looked at the scientific rationale, structure, and evidence base of the Planetary Health Diet. Now, let us do a quick exercise to explore how this framework could translate into a realistic clinical scenario. Imagine you are advising a 52-year-old patient with hypertension and prediabetes who consumes red meat daily. How would you design a dinner plate consistent with the Planetary Health Diet that you would recommend to this patient to improve health? Remember the checklist. At least half the plate made up of vegetables, whole grains as the staple, legumes or nuts as the primary protein source, unsaturated oil for cooking, no sugar-sweetened beverage. Here is an example of a dinner plate for such a patient. Half plate of roasted broccoli, spinach, and carrots, quarter plate of brown rice or millet, lentil and chickpea curry for protein, olive oil for cooking, and water or unsweetened tea as a beverage. Now try to reflect. Which substitutions reduced cardiometabolic risk pathways? How might replacing red meat with legumes affect fiber intake and blood lipid levels? How could this meal be adapted to the patient's cultural food preferences? Which components align most clearly with the strongest evidence reviewed in Lesson 2? The objective is not dietary absolutism, but a proportional shift. Rebalancing the plate toward a larger proportion of plant-based foods is one practical way to apply the evidence discussed throughout this lesson. Before we wrap up this lesson, let's look at the key takeaways to recap what we learned. First, the Planetary Health Diet was derived from a synthesis of global evidence on diet-disease relationships, not primarily from environmental goals. Second, it translates consistent epidemiological and trial evidence into quantitative reference intake ranges. Third, the Planetary Health Diet emphasizes plant-rich dietary patterns, allowing none to moderate animal source intake depending on preference, and limits processed meat, added sugars, and sodium. Fourth, higher adherence is associated with substantially lower mortality risk. Fifth, environmental benefits arise largely from reduced reliance on animal source foods. Therefore, the Planetary Health Diet achieves dual goals of improving human health and reducing environmental footprint. For clinicians, The Planetary Health Diet provides a structured yet adaptable framework. The final module of this course will focus entirely on practical implementation, how to communicate this evidence clearly, how to construct culturally relevant meals, and how to integrate healthy and sustainable diets into daily clinical practice. Before you move to the next lesson, let's assess your learning through a quick question. Based on what you learned in this lesson, answer the following question. Which statement best reflects the role of the Planetary Health Diet? A. It eliminates all animal source foods. B. It prioritizes environmental modeling over health evidence. C. It operationalizes global diet disease evidence into a practical dietary pattern. D. It focuses primarily on single nutrients. The correct answer is C. The Planetary Health Diet operationalizes global evidence on diet disease relationships into a practical dietary pattern. A key clinical skill is recognizing that dietary patterns matter more than isolated nutrients. The Planetary Health Diet provides one evidence-based example of how to translate that insight into practice. In the next lesson, we will examine one of the most extensively studied dietary patterns in nutritional science, the Mediterranean diet. As another example of a healthy dietary pattern, we will explore how its components align with the evidence reviewed in Lesson 2 and what major cohort studies and trials show about its health effects. We would value your feedback. Please scan the QR code on screen to share your thoughts on the course content and help us improve this learning resource. Thank you for watching this lesson. This is the course on nutrition and planetary health, developed and presented by the Physicians Association for Nutrition and PANCO. You can now move on to the next lesson.